Great. Good evening. My name is John Clark, and I am here to lead another Come Follow Me kind of study group discussion for this week. So I welcome you all here, those of you who are seeing this live, and those of you who will be watching this on video. Welcome. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we'll look at what we're dealing with this week. Sorry, I had to fix a slide in the middle and I was like, "Ey." So this week, what we're studying is Matthew 8, Mark 2 through 4, and Luke 7. And then next week, it's Matthew 9 through 10, Mark 5, and Luke 9. In this discussion tonight, in this presentation tonight, I'm just going to take them all, the sections in Matthew altogether, the sections in Mark altogether, and the sections in Luke altogether, although we will be reading them at different times, okay? We'll be reading them over the 2 weeks, but it just was the only way my brain would be able to handle it. So you're stuck with me as me and my brain. So the purposes of the Come Follow Me study is to provide background and context, to give a few ideas for study in our homes, and then my email is there if you want to request a presentation or anything. Brother Haley asked for one of the slides last week. So occasionally people, have questions. I know that Brother Steve Vance, has sometimes asked a question that then led to an answer that came in the next lesson. So any of that's good. If you have a question or a comment or you want something, that's my email address. So this is just, yet again, the periodic table of the Bible. It just is the New Testament. It just is, okay, go away. It just kind of is an overview of the New Testament with the Gospels, the historical, the letters from Paul that are addressed to cities, the letters from Paul that are addressed to people, and then the other epistles or letters from other church leaders, and then the book of Revelation. So it just is that. And this is just an idea. It's not definitive, but kind of the current understanding of when these books were written and recorded. So even though the Gospels appear first, they are not the first to have been recorded. Okay. So just a little bit of a review of the Gospels. This is a review of the Gospel of Mark, which we talked about a little bit last week. And we talked about Mark and Matthew. And so we'll review those quickly, and then we'll do an overview of Luke and John. So the Gospel of Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. It's only 60% as long as Matthew, and 57% as long as Luke, and 72% as long as John. So there's a threefold narrative pattern that part one is in Galilee, which is where we have most of Jesus's public ministry. Then part two is the journey from Galilee to Jerusalem for the final Passover. And then part three is in Jerusalem. It's Jesus' final week, his confrontation with authorities, his execution, and the empty tomb. Okay. In the book of Mark, there is no story of Jesus' birth or early years. The story in Mark begins with his baptism by John. Though some of Jesus' teachings are recorded, much of it that we know is not recorded in Mark. It's missing about 200 verses that appear in Matthew and Luke. For example, there's no Lord's Prayer, and a lot of Jesus's best known parables are not included in the Gospel of Mark. It's very, very short. Mark does not portray Jesus as ever publicly proclaiming his identity as the Son of God or the Messiah until the end of his ministry. John is the opposite. Jesus is always saying, I am this, I am this, and I am this. The two affirmations of his exceptional status are private and not part of his public teaching. Those happen in Mark 8:27 through 30 and 14:61 through 62. Mark also contains no stories of the risen Jesus appearing to his followers. Okay? There's no story of Mary Magdalene or the road to Emmaus or appearing to any of the apostles, adding Thomas or anything like that. The narrative ends with the empty tomb, the women who come to the tomb, and the declaration by the angels that he is risen, he is not here. That's the end of the record of the Gospel of Mark. The other Gospels have significantly longer Easter stories, resurrection and post resurrection stories than Mark's 8 verses. Matthew has 28 verses, Luke has 53, and John has 56, which continue into the next few days or even weeks. Okay? And it introduces the themes of the way, the Spirit, and the gospel, or the good news. The way is what is his teachings. He referred to it as the way, and then teaching by the Spirit. Those are all features of the Gospel of Mark. So the Gospel of Mark chapters that we're reading are chapters 2 through 5 over the next 2 weeks. So in chapter 2, Jesus forgives sins. He heals a man with paralysis. He eats with tax gatherers and sinners and announces that he is the Lord of the Sabbath. Okay? We did a little bit of that last week from Matthew, where he's going through the fields and his disciples gather and glean from the ears of wheat. It's called corn, but corn is just any grain, and eat that on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees complain about that. And Jesus answers, well, didn't you read that David, who you revere, ate the showbread from the temple when he was hungry, and he was not condemned? So why are you condemning me? And also saying that I am the Lord of the Sabbath. So, it's my choice. Again, in chapter 3, he heals on the Sabbath day, and he's criticized by the Pharisees yet again for healing on the Sabbath day. And he says, is it good to do good on the Sabbath or evil on the Sabbath? He chooses and ordains the 12 apostles. He asks, so he's brought somebody who needs the devil cast out, and the Pharisees complain that he casts out the devil by the power of the devil. And he's like, wait a minute, can Satan cast out Satan? He speaks of blasphemy against the Holy Ghost, and identifies those who believe as being members of his family. Okay? He who believes is my father and my mother, my brother. Okay? In chapter 4, he gives the parable of the sower, the candle under a bushel. Remember, that's not a little bush. The seed growing secretly, and the mustard seed. And he stills the tempest, out on the Sea of Galilee. That all happens in Mark chapter 3. You can see it goes at a rather furious clip, all of these stories. In chapter 5, when he's on the other side of the Galilee, which we'll talk about in a minute, he casts out a legion of devils into the swine, and a woman is healed by touching Jesus' clothes, and he raises Jairus' daughter from the dead. So we'll take a look at those stories as well. Okay, that's what happens in Mark. Here's a little bit of an overview. This is new of the gospel. No, this is not new. This is still a little bit of a review. The Gospel of Mark. We talked a little bit about this last week. In many ways, Matthew is an expanded version of Mark's really short gospel. Matthew's gospel includes 90% of Mark, about 600 of Mark's 678 verses. Matthew's narrative adds 48 verses of birth stories, because we just saw that Mark doesn't start with the birth of Jesus. It starts with his baptism, and about 400 verses of Jesus's teachings. And almost half of these, about 200, are similar to those found in the Gospel of Luke. Unique to the Gospel of Matthew are parts of the Sermon on the Mount, the parable of the wheat and tares. It's more extended than in any other Gospel. The Sermon on the Mount covers 3 chapters. The parable of the wheat and tares, the hidden treasure, parable of the pearl of great price, the unmerciful servant, and the workers who work in the vineyard. They are recruited to work in the vineyard. Some work longer than others, but the pay is the same. Okay. Matthew is the only gospel that places the Sermon on the Mount as being delivered from a mountain. Okay. The other gospels that make reference to the teachings don't talk about it being on a mountain. Matthew's text quotes Old Testament prophecy more than the other Gospels, more than 40 times with an explicit phrase like "it is written" or "you have heard of old," another 21 times without such a phrase. So a lot of Matthew's Gospel, we assume, is meant to help the children of Israel, the Jews, understand that Jesus is the Messiah because it's connecting their Hebrew Bible scriptures with Jesus and his ministry. In Matthew, Jesus restricts his mission during his lifetime to the Jews. It is only in the last verses of Matthew that the risen Jesus commissions his followers to go out to the nations or the Gentiles. The nations in the New Testament means the Gentiles. Jesus' final words in Matthew are, "I am with you always." And Jesus' name, Emmanuel, is God is with us. So there's a reference to one of his names being Emmanuel, or God with us. So the chapters that we're looking at for these next 2 weeks in Matthew are 8 through 10, and you'll see some similarities between the content that we saw in Mark. Jesus heals a leper, which is not entirely true. He cleanses a leper in Matthew chapter 8. He cures the centurion's servant and others. He stills the tempest that we saw in Mark, and casts out devils, and the devils enter a herd of swine. Okay. Jesus forgives sins. He heals a paralytic. We read that in chapter 2. That's referred to in chapter 2 of Mark, and calls Matthew. Jesus eats with sinners, heals a woman who touches his garment, and raises Jairus' daughter to life. That we've read in we've seen the overview in Mark chapter 5. He opens the eyes of the blind, casts out a devil, and preaches the gospel. In chapter 10, Jesus instructs and empowers the 12 apostles and sends them forth to preach, minister, and heal the sick. And he tells the people that those who receive the 12 receive the Lord. They receive him. Okay? He tells his apostles that the people receiving them is the same as receiving him. Okay? So let's just take a minute to look at Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. In the overview, it incorrectly says that he cures the centurion's servant. He heals a leper. He doesn't heal the leper, he cleanses the leper. Okay? So, when he was come down from the mountain, this is Matthew chapter 8, 1 through 4, the mountain where he delivered the Sermon on the Mount, great multitudes follow him. And behold, there came a leper and worshipped him, saying, Lord, if thou wilt, thou canst make me clean. And Jesus put forth his hand and touched him, saying, I will, be thou cleansed. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus saith unto him, See thou tell no man. Often after healing, he instructs the person who's healed, don't tell anybody, but go thy way, show thyself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a testimony unto them, the priests or the ecclesiastical leaders. It's for a testimony to them. Don't tell the whole world, but do as the law of Moses instructs when you're cleansed from leprosy. Okay? Leprosy is a word from the Greek that means scaly. In the Hebraic root is tsara, and the Greek root is lepros. They are of a broader classification than the more narrow use of the term related to the modern Hansen's disease. Leprosy today is known as Hansen's disease. Okay? But the leprosy referred to in the Bible is much broader. The symptoms and the conditions are much broader and rather different from Hansen's disease, which is what we call leprosy today, the official name of leprosy today. So in the Bible, any progressive skin disease, a whitening or splotchy bleaching of the skin, or raised manifestations of scales, scabs, infections, rashes, etc., as well as generalized molds and surface discoloration of any clothing, leather, or discoloration of walls or surfaces throughout homes, all came under the law of leprosy, which is in Leviticus 14. So in Leviticus, under the law of Moses, you can have a wall in your house that is leprous, okay? It's got a mold or a scale or discoloration, or leather, or any of those kinds of things, okay? in the Hebrew Bible of the Old Testament, there was no provision for healing of leprosy. Okay? Under the law of Moses and in the Hebrew Bible, leprosy is not healed, it's cleansed, which is kind of a temporary, an in remission situation. Okay? Because there is even provisions if leprosy comes again. This is what you have to do again in Leviticus 14. Only for the condition being declared by the priest as being cleansed. The rules for dealing with leprosy and proof of cleansing, including you have to be examined by the priest they declare that you have leprosy, and then when you're cleansed, they declare you cleansed if the conditions go away for a certain period of time. And then there are sacrificial offerings that are performed once you are declared clean from from leprosy, which is outlined in Leviticus chapter 14. So when Jesus says, "See thou tell no man, but go thy way, show thyself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded," those instructions are in Leviticus 14 under the law of Moses. Now, I know I'm being kind of picky when I say that in this one, the leper is cleansed, because in the New Testament, Jesus both cleanses the leper and heals lepers. Okay? So there can be a distinction between the two. Okay? And healing of leprosy, meaning that it is gone never to return, was for especially the Pharisees, for the Jews at the time of Jesus' day, was one of the signs of the Messiah, walking on water, casting out devils, and healing leprosy were all considered common signs of what the Messiah would be capable of doing looking forward. Okay? So I think it's just from this important to know that if you're looking for signs of what we consider leprosy today in the New Testament or the Old Testament, they're not exactly there. It's a different thing. It's been translated from the Greek as leprosy, but it isn't the medical diagnosis that we would say is leprosy today, which is Hansen's disease. Okay. And then again in chapter 8, this is just a little map help. Geography can help us understand some things, okay? So in Matthew 8:5, Jesus is in Capernaum, which is right here on the west side of the Galilee, okay? Then in 8:28, he goes across the Sea of Galilee to the Gergesenes. And those are, it's hard to tell here, but those are the hills near the city of Gergesa, okay? And this is where the evil spirits are cast out into swine, okay? So and then he goes back later in Matthew 9 to his own city, which would be Nazareth, okay? So you might wonder, why does it matter which side of the Sea of Galilee he's in? Well, I'll tell you, it helps in our understanding of a couple of things. In Mark 5:13, and also in Luke chapter 7, which we don't read for some reason, I don't know, it records that he casts evil spirits out of a person into swine, into pigs. Now, you might wonder, under the law of Moses, since pork and eating of pigs and dealing with pigs is prohibited by the law of Moses, why would people raise swine? Okay. Well, one of the reasons is that on the west side of the Sea of Galilee, there were more Romans and other people who had migrated to the land roundabout. So by population, there were more Gentiles on this east side of the Sea of Galilee, okay? Most of the healings are done here, okay? And more often than not, you'll read that if the healings are done on this side, he doesn't always say, don't tell anybody. But among the house of Israel, he instructs people a lot, don't tell anyone. Oftentimes it's not effective because the people go out and tell all about it anyway. Okay. So Capernaum's here. Gennesaret is a name of a city. Sometimes the Sea of Galilee in the New Testament is called the Sea of Gennesaret, because Gennesaret is a city close to the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum is a city that the name is Latin. It's Roman. It is not a Hebrew name. Okay, Bethsaida is Hebrew. Some Nazareth is Hebrew. Nain is Hebrew. Decapolis, or this area on the east side of the River Jordan, is a Greek name. Okay, so you can tell the influences of the civilizations and the languages that surround the children of Israel at this time. Nain is going to be important in a little bit, and it's important to know where Decapolis is. But I think sometimes it's good to whip out a map to see what side of the Sea of Galilee we're on, because it can have a little bit of a difference in our understanding of the story. Why would Jews be raising swine? They weren't Jews, most likely. They were a Gentile who was raising swine. Okay. Then I have a little scripture study activity that you can do with your family. There is the story of healing Jairus' daughter, and included in that story, often just smack dab in the middle of it, is the story of the woman with the issue of blood that Jesus heals. She is healed by touching his garment. Okay, so you can compare the accounts of the raising of Jairus' daughter, and included in that story, it's a little subplot of the story. The story usually begins, and then as he's going to Jairus' house, this woman touches his garment. Okay, both of those narratives are intertwined. One is recorded in Mark chapter 5, verse 20 through 33, 13 verses, and then in Matthew chapter 9, 18 through 26. Okay, so it would be interesting to gather your family together, or as a pair, to kind of read a couple of verses from one and then a couple of verses from the next, and just compare the narrative. How are the accounts similar in each gospel? And how are they different? What details do you have? What's different? This story also appears in Luke chapter 7, which we don't read as part of our reading this week, but you can compare 3 of them if you want to. But these are the 2 that are in our reading. And then one thing that's important to understand about the woman with the issue of blood meaning she has blood coming from her. Okay, she has a wound that isn't healing. Okay, and the common notion is it's sort of like menstruation that doesn't stop. But under the law of Moses, a woman who is bleeding in any fashion is considered ritually unclean and is prohibited from appearing in public. Okay, so her faith that she could be healed just by touching his garment is also increased by the fact that she's willing to set aside the tradition of the law of Moses in order to meet with Jesus and touch his garment. Okay, so when he talks about her great faith, it isn't just the notion that if I touch him, I will be healed. It's the action of actually coming out into the public, which she was prohibited from doing, and going out and seeking him out and touching the hem of his garment. That's another issue, that if we don't understand the law of Moses, which we don't study very much in the Old Testament, but when we understand it, it can bring more understanding to our discussions about the New Testament. Okay, any questions up to this point? Any concerns? Anybody want to unmute and just ask a question or make a comment? Bueller? It's okay. I don't
Nope.
have
No questions.
Okay, that's great. I don't mind if you just listen. I just don't want to be like rolling over everyone. This is Brother Clark's steamroller lesson. Okay. All right. Then I think we'll just go on and do a little bit. These are new, an overview of the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles form a single narrative. They're both written by the same author and share unifying themes. Both are addressed to Theophilus, lover of God. This is a review. Matthew was not a review. Matthew is new. A lover of God. The Theophilus could be an individual person's name, a person named Theophilus, or it could refer to a group that the author of Acts refers to as the God lovers, sending this message to the lovers of God. Okay. The author of the Gospel of Luke is not named in the written text, but second-century Christians assigned the authorship to Luke, the same Luke who was a companion to Paul on his mission in 50 AD. Okay, so that's kind of a tradition that grows up outside the record of the scriptures. The Gospel of Luke, a major theme in the Gospel of Luke is the Spirit. Jesus is conceived by the Spirit. The Spirit descends upon him at baptism. The first words of his public ministry, which he reads from Isaiah, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. His last words for the cross are, into your hands I commend my spirit. Luke's gospel ends with Jesus' promise that the Spirit will descend upon his followers. So as you're reading Luke, look for the theme of the Spirit, okay? It contains several hundred verses that are unique to his gospel only, including some stories of Jesus' conception and birth. For example, the whole story of the birth of John the Baptist and Mary and Elizabeth and Zacharias being mute and when he encounters the Lord at the altar in the temple, not in the Holy of Holies, but in the holy place, the altar of incense that's in front of the veil. Those are all unique to Luke, okay? Parables like the Good Samaritan and the prodigal son, the woman and the lost coin, the Pharisee and the tax collector, the two that are praying, you know, the dishonest steward and the widow and the unjust judge. Those are all unique to Luke. The Gospel of Luke emphasized marginalized people, Gentiles, shepherds, tax collectors, the unclean, and there are more stories and incidents and more details of incidents featuring women than in any other of the Gospels. So Luke, because he includes stories a lot of Gentiles more than the other Gospels, and women, and again, marginalized people, Luke tends to have an appeal to the not just the Jews or the children of Israel, but also the Gentiles later, that Christ sends his apostles on their ministry is to the Gentiles, okay? So the ones that we look at are, sorry, Luke, it's in chapter 8. I've been saying 7, it's in chapter 8. In chapter 8 is what we don't read. Luke chapter 7 and 9. In chapter 7, he heals the centurion's servant. And remember that the centurion is probably not a Jew. A centurion is a soldier who is in charge of 100 soldiers in the Roman army. Hence, centurion, 100, okay? And he's described as contributing to building a synagogue. A synagogue in Jesus' day was a school that you went to. You didn't worship at a synagogue, you studied at a synagogue. You worshiped at the temple, okay? So in between times in the Old Testament when when Jerusalem is conquered the first time, just before Lehi and his family leave, they're without a temple for about 80 years. And worship then is kind of a little bit done in the synagogue. Study is done in the synagogue, but it isn't considered worship because you only worship at the temple. Now, with this restoration, Herod's temple, which is the temple at Jesus' time, is a big, huge remodel of the second temple, the temple of Zerubbabel that the people built when they returned from their captivity in Babylon. It's huge by comparison, okay? But in 70 AD, when that temple is destroyed unto the present time, where there is no temple to worship at, you substitute kind of worshipful activities at the school or the synagogue, okay? Because there is no place to worship, okay? That's also the reason that even though at Passover, the meal is to be lamb, that lamb was meant to be sacrificed at the temple, okay? So in typical modern Passovers, the protein of the meal is not lamb. It's chicken or brisket, some economical kind of meat. But the lamb is remembered as part of the story of Passover because part of the things that go on a Passover plate are a lamb bone that is roasted or scorched. Okay, so that stands in for the sacrificial lamb that the scriptures instruct they should be eating, that was meant to have been sacrificed at the temple. Since there's no temple, can't be done. Okay. So he heals the centurion's servant. He does that. He raises from the death the widow of Nain. Okay, and Nain, you'll see, we'll go back to it's on this side. It's just south of Nazareth, Jesus's own city. Okay, he heals that. He does more than that. He brings them back to life. Okay. He raises from the dead the son of the widow of Nain. He praises John the Baptist as more than a prophet. A woman anoints his feet, and he forgives her sins. Okay. In chapter 7, he's invited by a Pharisee to come and eat with him. And in the middle of that, this woman who is known as a sinner comes in and anoints his feet and wipes them clean with her hair. And of course, Simon the Pharisee is like, why do you let this sinner do this? And that's when in Luke, he tells the story of he tells a parable of a servant who is forgiven a small amount of debt and a servant who's forgiven a larger amount of debt, and who loves him more because of how much he was forgiven. Okay. Then in chapter 9, we have the familiar 12 are sent out. He feeds the 5,000. Peter testifies of Christ. He foretells his resurrection. He's transfigured on the mount, and he heals and teaches. Okay. So some of these don't overlap the story exactly. Okay. But those are the things we're looking for. Okay. Lastly, I'm going to end with just an overview of the Gospel of John, even though we don't have any readings of the gospel in the Gospel of John yet. I think it's important to understand the differences between the Gospels. The first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are called synoptic Gospels. The synoptics mean that they're synchronous. Okay, they tell basically the same story. Okay. In the synoptics, Jesus frequently teaches in parables. In John, he speaks in extended and complex discourses, okay? And John doesn't cover the same amount of history and covers it very differently than the other Gospels. There is no casting out of devils in the Gospel of John. In the synoptics, Jesus' public ministry is mostly in Galilee, and only his final journey takes him to Judea. In John, Jesus has several periods of public activity in Judea and in Jerusalem. So remember, Judea is south, and Nazareth is north. Okay. In the Synoptics, there's only one Passover that's recorded, which includes the story of the Last Supper. In John, there are three, one for every year of his public ministry. So he does the Passover, year one of his public ministry, another Passover, year two, and then the third one is the ending of his ministry. Okay. John's gospel delivers more of his narrative of Jesus' final week in Jerusalem than any other gospels. More than half of John is about Jesus' final week, which is why in our readings at this point, John doesn't feature every week because he just doesn't tell that story. He's not interested in that part of the story. Well-known events that are unique to the Gospel of John include the wedding at the Feast of Cana, turning water into wine, which, according to John, is his first public miracle. And then the story of Nicodemus, who comes to him in the night and asks about being born again, and Jesus teaches him about being born again. The Samaritan woman at the well is unique to the Gospel of John. The raising of Lazarus right before his own resurrection, on his way to Jerusalem at his final Passover, he raises Lazarus, appearing to Mary Magdalene near the empty tomb, specifically to her alone. She's mentioned among the women who go to the tomb and find it empty, but the dialogue between Christ and Mary Magdalene alone, the two of them together, is unique to John. And showing his wounds after his resurrection to the apostles, and then Thomas isn't there, okay? It says the other apostles tell him about him. It says he won't believe till he sees them himself. And Jesus then presents his hands and feet to be examined by Thomas, who doubts until the moment when he sees them himself, okay? Teachings unique to the Gospel of John include the I am statements, okay? This is where, like in Mark and Matthew, especially in Matthew, he kind of keeps his status a little bit secret from the public. But in this, he teaches, I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the gate or the door by whom everyone needs to enter. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way meaning the pattern for returning to the Father, the truth and the life. And I am the true vine, okay? Jesus uses the phrase, translated to English in John, John uses the phrase, translated it into English as eternal life in the New Revised Standard Version, or in the King James Version, everlasting life, 17 times. The Greek phrase translated into English as eternal or everlasting life is more accurately translated as the life in the age to come. Okay, so that has implications that are both on earth and in the afterlife, because the life in the age to come can mean the millennium, okay? The term the Jews in the Gospel of John should be understood as the Jewish authorities, or simply the authorities. They are not just everyone who happens to be a Jew. In John, it's related specifically to the Jewish authorities who are, under the law of Moses, both the ecclesiastical or religious authorities and the legal authorities under the law of Moses, okay? Because the law of Moses includes religious practices as well as civil practices, okay? So that will help us with the Gospel of John. Now, I know I didn't dig very far into the specifics of the scriptures, because these are really rich chapters that I want the gospel doctrine teachers to be able to choose and not overlap very much. Okay. My main goal this week was to sort of give you an overview and give you some ideas about or some new information about how we might look at the scriptures through our reading. So I don't have a map this week of all of the land of Israel at Jesus' time, but this is up north near the Sea of Galilee. As we go down the Jordan River and we head toward the Dead Sea in the south, this is where Jerusalem and Judea are. Okay. So the synoptic gospels, they have most of his ministry happening here and only his last week happening in the south, whereas John has him in the south for Passovers and then going back and forth several times. That's one of the differences. Okay. So that's kind of what I have for you this week. So just as a review, here's my email address, and in case you have questions or something comes up in the reading where you're like, what is that? I don't know whether I said this. The issue of blood is not, it means that blood is issuing forth from her. It doesn't mean what on our vernacular we have an issue with or a problem with. Yes, it is a problem, but issue in that day means blood is issuing from her in some place or another. Okay. So there's my email address. And then for the next 2 weeks, we're reading for this week, starting today, Matthew 8, Mark 2 through 4, and Luke 7. And then for next week, Matthew 9 and 10, Mark 5, and Luke 9. So that's our reading. So that's kind of what I have for today. Unless there's any other questions or concerns, I will stop sharing. And Bueller, anybody?
Just again, thank you, Brother Clark, for another excellent lesson. I don't know if Brother Bonnie or the Bonnies or the Evans have any questions.
If you do, sing out. If not, that's okay. I'm not.
No, but thank you so much. That was awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks. I hope it helps. Like when you're reading the scriptures, sometimes you're like, what? What does that mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Why are there pigs? Why are Jews raising swine? That's an hurt. So I hope that kind of helps. I'm gonna go ahead and log off, and then Brother Lee, you can stop the recording. Thank you, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Brother
All
Clark.
right.